Today at the National Press Club, Commissioner of Jobs and Skills Australia, Professor Barney Glover. He started his 5-year term as Commissioner in April. Today he'll discuss skills in Australia and aligning need with know-how. Barney Glover with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia for today's Westpac address, and we are meeting here today on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra. I'm Julie Hare. I'm a Director of the Club and the Education Editor at the Australian Financial Review. Welcome today. Today's guest is Professor Barney Glover. He's the Commissioner of Jobs and Skills Australia. This speech was originally to be delivered by Minister Brendan O'Connor, but due to a ministerial reshuffle, Professor Glover has volunteered to fill in, so to speak. So we thank him for that. His speech is entitled Skills Success in Australia, Aligning Need with Know-How. Professor Glover AO began his 5-year term as Commissioner of Jobs and Skills Australia in April this year. He is a distinguished academic leader, an accomplished mathematician and maths educator with significant experience in developing strong relationships with the vocational education sector. He has previously held roles as Vice-Chancellor and President of Western Sydney University, which he did an excellent job rebranding, I've got to say, a few years ago. Chair of Universities Australia between 2015 and 2017. Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research at the University of Newcastle. I think they've forgotten here Charles Darwin University. Forgot Charles Darwin University, who could? Not me. Pro Vice-Chancellor of Research and Development at Curtin University and Fellow of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences. Please welcome Professor Glover.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you to the Press Club. And thank you to Westpac for your support. It's great to be here. Thank you for everyone for coming. I want to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet today, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd like to particularly acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today on unceded land, honouring their continuing connection to country and community. When I spoke here at the National Press Club a few years ago, I reflected on the ancient Birugay artworks in nearby Tidbinbilla and how sites like this connect every Australian who visits them. This theme of connection is central to my speech today. Every Australian in work and in training deserves to feel connected, to feel a part of a system that acknowledges their effort and fuels their aspirations. The role of Jobs and Skills Australia, the agency I lead, is to provide evidence-based advice to government on optimising those connections. We draw on data and analysis on the jobs of today and those emerging, and we forecast the skills that we will need for the labour market of the future. We are central to the new skills architecture developed and now being embedded. We're essential to the commitment by state, territory and Commonwealth governments to a new era of enhanced cooperation and stewardship of skills, training and higher education. We're at the forefront of solving the big national challenges, such as gender equality in the labour market. Our legislation commits us to guiding government on how all Australians can participate to their full potential in the exciting opportunities, job opportunities of the future. The integrated data assets we mine show very clearly the transformative power of tertiary education. The evidence is clear. Education improves lives, it increases median incomes, reduces dependency on income support, and opens pathways to further study. The data also confirms how crucial education, tertiary education in particular, is to closing the gap for First Nations people. It's sobering to reflect that while progress is being made, it's far too slow. The target is clear. By 2030, we want 70% of 25 to 34-year-old First Nations people to have a post-secondary qualification. We stand at just 47% in 2021, up from 42% in 2016. We must do better. Addressing this very press club some years ago as Chair of Universities Australia, I extolled the virtues of investment in our universities. I urged greater support of their research capacity, and I spoke of their ability to transform the Australian economy, to shine a light on truth and to contest challenging new ideas. Years later, the message hasn't changed. It is, however, more pressing. Having served on the University's Accord Review Panel last year, commissioned by Minister Jason Clare and led so ably by Professor Mary O'Kane, I can confirm the need to build our universities for the future has never been greater. It is a critical national imperative, not simply an educational or sector-oriented priority. But something even more profound has emerged: the urgent need for a more connected tertiary education system in this country. While I don't resile for a moment from the case I made here nearly a decade ago for our universities, this time I bring a sharper focus. Today I'm concerned with the vital need for better alignment between our tertiary education sectors. In the interests of connection, in the national interest, I believe we need to rebalance Australian post-secondary education. The needs of our economy and the imperative to transform demand it. To have a future made in Australia, inclusive of regional Australia, to be a clean energy superpower, to leverage AUKUS Pillar 2, to dramatically reshape our defence industries, and to decarbonise our economy, we must rebalance. It's a big ask, but it's not a cold start. We have a world-class university sector. We have a high-quality education and training system. We have great TAFEs. Our starting point is the envy of our international competitors. We're talking about macro-level change, but that can't happen unless we understand the micro. Recently, I've had the pleasure of meeting many young Australians emerging from post-secondary education. A young couple exemplified the opportunities. One, an apprentice just about to complete an electrical trade, and their partner, a recently graduated nurse from an Australian university. They're about to move to regional WA after travel and work for a while around the world with their very highly mobile qualifications, and then to return. They want to upskill and reskill when they need to, and they want the option to move in and out of the workforce as they raise their family. Another, a mature person, dropped out of school, reconnected through a vet and school program, completed an apprenticeship with a few challenges along the way, now a highly skilled systems controller at our national energy regulator, managing one of the most important transitions to renewables in the Australian energy system. Our education system has afforded them these choices, but we need to ensure those opportunities are more accessible, scalable, and connected to meet the challenges ahead. We know that post-secondary education greatly enhances employability. Unemployment rates for young people, those aged 25 to 34, without Year 12 or any tertiary qualification are above 10%. For those with a higher education, that figure is just 3.5%. Our training system's asymmetries bring the challenge of connectedness into focus. In the 2021 census, over 11 million Australians reported having a non-school qualification, post-secondary education. That's an impressive 20% increase since 2016. Around 5.5 million reported having a bachelor's degree or higher as their highest qualification. That's a staggering 31% increase since 2016. Just on 4 million people reported having a certificate 1 to 4, which is only an 11% increase since 2016. Compared to 2011, if we take a decadal view, the number of people with a bachelor's degree or higher has grown by 67% between 2011 and 2021, whereas those with the certificate 1 to 4 group as their highest qualification has grown only 25% the population grew 14% in that period. And it's important to note that many of the higher education graduates also had VET qualifications, and we need to encourage much more of that. But it's interesting to look at the way the system changed in a decade and the fact that we can bring about major macro-level change in this country. The system, however, clearly needs rebalancing. We need significant growth in higher education and, critically, in vocational education and training. We must reduce the discrepancy between where students are studying now, whether VET or higher education, and the job requirements of the future. Every Jobs and Skills Australia workforce capacity study or employment projection makes it abundantly clear. Our projections show that 90% of jobs growth in the next 10 years will require post-secondary education, with 44% requiring a VET qualification and others requiring both VET and higher ed. This is even more stark when you consider the construction and infrastructure-intensive period ahead as we build houses and we transition to decarbonise the economy. It's never been just a skills and jobs question. It's a question of our ability to address national priorities. Fortunately, the policy framework to guide the necessary change is clear. And importantly, it includes the establishment of Jobs and Skills Australia with our remit, alongside our Jobs and Skills Councils, who undertake the workforce planning at an industry level and the important task of training package reform. We also have the implementation of key recommendations from the University's Accord Review, particularly the government considering steps to more effectively manage both domestic and international student load. And we have measures to better support access and participation by underrepresented groups in higher education. Achieving ambitious targets in post-secondary education is impossible without the expanded access to and involvement in tertiary education by First Nations people. Equally, we need to dramatically lift access for those from low socioeconomic backgrounds, people with a disability, and those from regional and remote areas. Tertiary harmonisation is a vital component, supported by a national skills taxonomy, something that Jobs and Skills Australia is developing at the moment. The Employment White Paper committed to defining the scope, outcomes and benefits of a national skills passport. Consultations are now complete and the government is considering that feedback. A skills passport could be a critical factor in promoting agility in our skills system. And we must be sector agnostic. We must reinforce the focus on skills, because skills are the lingua franca of prospective employers, not qualifications, not credentials. We need to get real, we need to be relevant. Key policy statements, including the Employment White Paper and the new migration strategy, have been released. Importantly, Jobs and Skills Australia is advising the government on skilled migration and its relationship with occupations in shortage. And the National Skills Agreement between the Commonwealth and the state and territory governments is in place. It brings with it significant new investment. And, importantly, it emphasises the centrality of TAFE in VET reform. So we have an architecture for an effective national skills system, and JSA is central to that architecture. But do we have the strategies to exploit these key policies, and are we missing a critical moment? Let's start with skill shortages. Our analysis suggests that skill shortages are often persistent, not just a reflection of a currently strong labour market, and many of the occupations we find to be in shortage are going to be in strong demand in the future, driven by the transition to net zero, the growth in the care and support economy, and the rise of digital technologies. Our projections raise the question, do we have the balance right between the service and producing occupations? This all highlights the importance of understanding the reasons for our underlying skill shortages. Firstly, addressing them is not simply about the capacity of our education and training system. Governments have the levers necessary to expand delivery. They have the means to redirect funding to address training gaps. The other reasons for shortages, which are at record highs, relate to, for example, gender skewing in the workforce. Male and female-dominated occupations are in much higher levels of shortage, in part due to stereotypical attitudes to types of work, safety and the culture of workplaces and worksites. These drivers also limit the labour market opportunities for other diverse workers who look, sound or physically are different. Similarly, suitability gaps between the skills of recent graduates and the needs of industry is another driver of labour market need. Same goes for recent vet completers as much as those graduating from university. Plus, we have retention gaps driven by occupations with relatively poor employment conditions, remuneration or workplace cultures. That's an issue of particular concern. Recent steps to address these issues structurally with respect to employee rights and obligations are, however, beginning to bring about change. Uplifting all Australians to participate to their full potential in the labour market requires us to tackle these issues. We must do so from a sovereign risk perspective. Long-term recourse to skilled migration is not the only option. The questions remain. What can we do about it, and can we afford to wait? Since taking on the role of Commissioner, I've been impressed by the responses I've seen around Australia. I'm greatly encouraged by the ideas emerging and how they're being implemented. At every opportunity, I now extol the virtues of innovation and creativity in our TAFE system. I do the same with respect to the system's approach to industry engagement. And I just want to highlight a few of these. Firstly, I want to highlight partnerships. Collaboration is critical to addressing the suitability gap I referred to. Partnerships between industry and education and training providers are essential in developing and co-designing courses and training programs for the future. We must ensure people completing qualifications have relevant contemporary skills. The new TAFE Centres of Excellence in priority areas such as electric vehicles, clean energy, care industries, early childhood are being planned on this basis of partnership, led by TAFE with industry and university partners. Similarly, the New South Wales Institutes of Technology in digital technologies and construction innovation are driving new micro-skill and micro-credential models alongside integrated vet and university programs. And degree apprenticeships are emerging, such as the one at RMIT, focused on systems engineering with AI Group and a well-articulated vet and university pathway. These programs are coupled with an earn while you learn model of work-integrated learning. There are others, all encouraging, all thinking outside the box, all trying to overcome systemic barriers to collaboration between our sectors. Second, emerging approaches to retention gaps are producing positive results. The government response to workforce challenges in the early childhood, education and care sector saw a significant prospective uplift in salaries. Jobs and Skills Australia is about to release a major workforce capacity study jointly undertaken with the Human Ability Jobs and Skills Council. It will show that while significantly increasing salaries is vital, so too is qualification reform, professional development and career progression. The Construction Industry Culture Task Force is an additional example. The new culture standard they've developed and begun implementing in trials is another very targeted approach to addressing workforce retention and gender segregation issues. Trials are demonstrating that very challenging workplaces and work practices can be changed to make this industry more attractive and accessible. Industry stewardship, training package reform and the work of our Jobs and Skills Councils in a tripartite environment is emerging as a critical response to addressing skill shortages. Engaging with governments, business and unions is a vital component of the approach. Lasting and effective change won't be possible if we don't work together. These are great examples and many others are emerging, and we should celebrate the innovation, We should learn from each other, and we should push hard for the widespread take-up of effective strategies and ideas. But there is something more we need to do. And we need to do it now, we need to do it systematically, and we need to do it quickly. We must uplift the aspirations of young people to consider career options across the full tertiary spectrum. I'll be blunt. We need to raise enthusiasm in numbers too big to ignore for vocational education and training from deep within our school system. This means quality careers advice. It means improved vet in school programs and associated infrastructure. And it means fostering greater awareness of the exciting careers available now and in the future. Essentially, we need to urgently address, with all the energy we can muster, the cultural challenge of ensuring we promote a parity of esteem between vet and TAFE in particular and higher education. We must do that with and for young people and with those who influence their decisions. We know that high-quality careers advice is central to motivation and increasing preparedness for tertiary education. Parents, teachers, career advisors, mentors all need to be encouraging young people in a very targeted way. They need to impart the transformative promise of post-secondary education, and we need them to help young people see vocational education and training as a connected option, an option that links them into a career, education and higher education in particular, and progression opportunities across the board. Over the next decade, we'll see the proportion of new jobs requiring tertiary education qualifications increase from 70 to over 90%. The government has set an ambitious attainment target of 80% of the working age population having tertiary level skills by 2050. That target may even prove to be an underestimate. And we certainly need to better understand the spread and blend of skills and qualifications across the vet and higher education spectrum. We also need to brace ourselves for new models, not only of delivering skills training in higher education, but also in the shape and the flexibility of the qualifications themselves. Upskilling and reskilling will require more flexible and modular credentials available and delivered just in time through a variety of modalities. And all this while ensuring we maintain the key tenets of our training architecture: qualifications framework, safety, industry relevance and employment conditions. There are other challenges that loom large. Minister Clare has recently commented that Year 12 completion rates have fallen from 90 to 79%. And we're all aware of the post-COVID mental health challenges many young people are facing. This is made worse by the impact and the pervasiveness of social media. Contending with these challenges will not be easy. There are, as I said, encouraging signs, and I'm particularly impressed by the South Australian Government initiative to establish a number of high-quality, well-equipped senior technical colleges. These models are vital alternative pathways for young people to experience vocational training in a work-like environment. They help them make informed choices about their future and their future career options. It's very much a post-16 rather than post-18 view of the future. Perhaps in some ways it's a back to the future approach, but in the right settings it can and it will work. And I'm aware that other states and territories are actively engaged in considering other approaches to the challenge. A national approach to vet in schools is also vitally needed. A new post-16 view of education and educational pathways that brings together successful approaches is well worth considering. It's also essential that we recognise the importance of our apprenticeship system. Ian Ross and Lisa Paul are due to submit their review of the system very soon. Jobs and Skills Australia has provided data and analysis to support the review, with a particular focus on apprenticeship outcomes compared to non-apprenticeship pathways. Importantly, pointing out the importance and the success of our apprenticeship scheme in this country. Issues of attrition, retention, pastoral care, mentorship of young apprentices must be addressed to build our essential trades for the future. They are pivotal in addressing our skill shortages. Interestingly, one multinational company in the infrastructure space refers to their tradespeople as construction craft professionals. And there are compelling models for at-scale apprenticeship training with impressive responses to gender imbalance, such as BHP's Future Fit Academies in WA and Queensland. Industry needs to lean in and own the challenges and the responses. This is not only an Australian challenge. Jobs and Skills Australia is involved in discussions on better understanding our global skills system with counterparts in Asia and in Europe. The new UK government has just established Skills England, our sister organisation in the United Kingdom, and is developing a national skills classification system. I recently returned from the South Pacific, particularly from Fiji, and discussed the role of jobs and skills in responding to skill shortages. Fiji is committed to a major revamp of its national vet policy, including expanded vet in school programs, and has introduced a new approach to government-sponsored apprenticeships. There is a real global context to understanding skills and training and labour mobility. I want to also acknowledge today our former Minister for Skills and Training, Brendan O'Connor, on his forthcoming retirement after more than 20 years in Parliament. He created Jobs and Skills Australia with the first piece of legislation in the current term of this government. I also acknowledge that this is, or about to be, National Skills Week, and I want to acknowledge Brian Wexham here as the Chair of National Skills Week. Starts next week, so it's a fitting time to acknowledge Minister O'Connor's contribution to the emerging transformation of the education and training system in this country. This includes the first National Skills Agreement in a decade, the establishment of the TAFE Centres of Excellence, and many other remarkable reforms. He believed deeply that TAFE was at the heart of reform and that we needed to build parity of esteem between our tertiary education sectors. He's done much to ensure we'll achieve that outcome. His focus on building strong partnerships with states, territories, employers and unions has been a real benefit to our work in presenting the big picture of jobs and skills across the nation and the centrality of JSA to that. In that same spirit, I'm pleased to welcome Senator the Honourable Murray Watt as the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations and the Honourable Andrew Giles MP to the role of Minister for Skills and Training. These are both key roles for our agency, and I'm excited to work with the incoming ministers on these priority areas. Minister Giles has already hit the ground running with the appointment of two new Deputy Commissioners we heard earlier for JSA, Megan Lilly and Trevor Gould, who join us here today, and I'm very pleased they're on board. Completing the architecture of Jobs and Skills Australia. I'll also acknowledge David Turvey, who was Acting Commissioner, and Peter Dawkins, who's here. Peter was the Interim Commissioner to establish JSA. It's great to have him with us today. Wonderful to have our Deputy Commissioners. The architecture of JSA is complete. Megan and Trevor bring experience across the business and training sectors and the union movement. I'm looking forward to working with them as we identify and recommend to government measures to address Australia's jobs and skills issues. I'm confident also of the contribution they'll make to providing the crucial contextualised advice that government needs to ensure we optimise our national skills system. Now, before I conclude, I wanted to return to the story of the young couple I mentioned earlier, the nurse and the electrician. It's actually a personal story. One is my grandson, and I'm incredibly proud of his choices and envious of their life ahead. The other, the mature age person I referred to, is my son, one of three, all completed apprenticeships and all have thrived in life, building families and a future. Connections run deep in the world of jobs and skills. They remind us of why, in the national interest, we must never rest, never resile, and never let future generations down. We are builders of generational aspiration. That is a heavy obligation, and it is an imperative to which we must remain fully committed, so all Australians can exercise their right to participate to their full potential. That starts with making the right connections. Thank you.
I assumed I should come here.
No, it's a trick.
It's a trick, yes. The podium is a trick.
Well, Barney, thank you so much. There's a lot in that speech, especially for nerds like me. I'll just start with one of your starting points, which talking about parity of esteem and bringing the vocational and higher education sectors closer together. And I've been writing about this for too many years, and it's been spoken about on a high level for all those years, but I've never seen it actually happen at all. Now then, when you were at Charles Darwin, that's a dual sector university, Denise Bradley spoke about it. It can't all come back down to micro-credentials. So how do we bring those two sectors closer together?
It certainly doesn't come down to micro-credentials, that's very true. Good. Although, I think our credential system will go through change over time, and that evolution is undeniable. Parity of esteem is a really important concept right now for young people, and I wanted to emphasise it in the speech because I think the decision-making over possibly the last 15 years since the demand-driven system was introduced into Australia's higher education system, the decision-making for young people has, I think all too frequently, defaulted to higher education as the preferred option. And we need now to see the investment in TAFE in particular and higher education more broadly, but TAFE in particular and VET, so that we can build that recognition of the wonderful opportunities that emerge through careers that connect to our VET and TAFE system. And as I mentioned, there are a variety of ways we can do that in supporting the choices people make. But parity of esteem requires us to have a tertiary system where we have a national skills agreement for the first time in a decade, where we have additional investment in TAFE and in vocational training, and where we have an Australian Tertiary Education Commission being touted by government that will involve, as part of its mandate, tertiary harmonisation. And in that context, it means how do we actually get these two systems to work better together? The fluidity across and between them. One of the reasons I wanted to emphasise skills and National Skills Week coming up is that I think skills are at the heart of understanding recognition of prior learning, better credit transfer, better advanced standing, better movement between our systems. It's one of a number of barriers we have to overcome. So the barriers are there. The architecture's emerging to help us address it. There's a commitment by government to resourcing the work we need to do. And at the core of it, and I touched on this in the speech, the core of it is understanding from the data and the evidence just how life-changing, how transformational post-secondary education can be with a vocational education and training pathway. And I think that information will help people make better choices. So it's partly standing up and talking about it, because I think we've got to put a focus on it, but it's equally important that we have policy settings at the state level, territory level and the federal level that can we actually work with. There are great examples of harmonisation in the system. I mentioned a few of them, right? And I could talk about Charles Darwin University. We tried to do some things in a dual sector context. There are great examples, but they generally succeed because people find a way to break through the barriers. It's not a systematic approach or a systemic approach. It's largely very dedicated people finding a way to make it work. And right now, we've never had a bigger imperative to make it work, because the jobs of the future need a different educational, post-secondary educational profile.
Okay. So I've got to ask though, isn't part of the problem on this in the difference between how these systems, vocational and higher education, are funded from a student's point of view? So if you go to university, you automatically get a HECS loan. You don't think about it. You don't think about paying it off until, unfortunately, you get a job and you've got to start paying it off. But we've seen with the vocational sector just a roller coaster of policies over the last 15 years or so, which, and to a large degree, have been very, very damaging to the sector. We do have free TAFE places at the moment, but they're not universal. So should there be a greater harmonisation, you like that word, harmonisation of the way that these systems are funded from a student's perspective?
Look, I think the fact that we do have a national skills agreement and we do have more investment is a very important step. Let's acknowledge the work that's been done to get us to that point. And I think there's a very strong focus at the state and territory level to work collaboratively with the Commonwealth over these issues. That's going to be important. States and territories very much connected to their TAFE systems and to vocational education and training. There's no doubt about it. Funding is different across the two systems. That leads to some of the challenges when you're trying to put together a program that might work across the two systems. Dual sector universities have to deal with this on a daily basis, and they do a great job at doing it. I referred to RMIT. Peter's here, of course. VU's been doing some great work in that space. All of the dual sectors do. We haven't seen growth in dual sectors as a model in Australia, by the way, since I think Central Queensland became a dual sector. So there's a bit of a structural challenge there. There's a growing interest, I think, around the country to look at more ways to enhance the collaboration. The funding issue is a challenging one. I accept that. I acknowledge it. We need to see more investment in vocational education and training.
Okay. So NAPLAN came out today.
NAPLAN.
It's not a pretty picture. As a country, I feel quite strongly, as a country we let down our young people, especially those from families that are doing it tough. We have an extraordinary percentage of young men, just under 50%, who are leaving school what I could call functionally illiterate. Can you talk to me about the importance of improving literacy, numeracy, learning outcomes for kids right across, not just the wealthy kids, right across the sector, and what that means in terms of improving productivity and our future economy?
This morning, before I came to the press club, I was on a panel at Regional Australia Institute Summit. It was a great event. Many people here might have been at the summit. And one of the speakers was talking about the importance of early childhood education and care, and quoted a piece of data about a child who has the opportunity to attend a high-quality education, early childhood centre, 50% more likely to go on to tertiary education. So we have to start young here to address the challenge of NAPLAN today. I don't think anyone is comfortable with what we're seeing as a nation today. And I'm sure this will activate politicians here in Canberra and around Australia to start to understand the challenge. It's not moving is more of the problem than the challenge. The challenge is deep and well known, but it's not moving the way we need it to. A lot of what I'm talking about today, which is uplifting aspiration for young people to go on to post-secondary education, is dependent on the quality of our secondary and primary education system. So, to his credit, Minister Clare did introduce reviews, and it's important to start with a knowledge base and an evidence base in early childhood. Productivity Commission working in that space, due to report soon, as I understand it. The work that Lisa O'Brien did in schools with the next stage of Gonski, the agreements with states, and then obviously what Mary O'Kane has done in the tertiary education space. There's a body of work emerging, the evidence from which, evidence-based recommendations from which, I think are imperative for government to implement. We do need to see change. We need to see the support of our teachers in schools improve. It's one thing for me to advocate the importance of post-secondary education and the enormous job opportunities in the future, coming off a situation where we have something like 36% of our occupations in shortage right now. If you're in a male-dominated occupation, you're 54% of them in shortage, 40% are female-dominated. We're in a situation where we need to encourage people to get into post-secondary education and progress. NAPLAN is a challenge that has to be addressed from today. I'm sure it'll be an imperative for governments. We also need to lift, and I think this is actually going to be an important part of response. I think we need to look at the sort of thing South Australia is looking at with senior secondary technical colleges in work-like environments where young people will have pathways and alternatives to really interesting career opportunities. Perhaps the last thing on this to say, just to reinforce the point, our clean energy capacity study that we completed last year, which is a very important seminal moment, I think, for understanding the clean energy workforce of the future, identified 38 occupations that are in shortage and will be in shortage over the next decade if we don't do something about the supply side in the labour market. But there are great opportunities here for young people in regional Australia as much as metropolitan Australia. We have to uplift aspiration and enthusiasm. I think that's got to be one of the parts. Yes, investment through Gonski, yes, investment in early childhood is absolutely vital. There's no doubt about it. We released a capacity study early in September on early childhood education and care. This is a very difficult workforce. There's a lot of attrition in that workforce. We need to support early childhood workers and educators. We have a series of recommendations to make. That's going to be, I think, another piece of evidence-based input to government that they'll need to respond to. I think there is a moment here when we all need to take... And by the way, the last thing to say on it, the last thing, is one thing I think became apparent to me when I wrote the speech, with great help from colleagues, was we can change the course of this country in 5 to 10 years. We should not think that these are intractable problems. And you and I were talking earlier, and I know you may mention international examples, but we demonstrated in higher education the difference we can make if we have a determination to do it. We need to do the same in vocational education and training. We don't have to wait 25 years and have this conversation again. Australia can do it.
So one of the key issues here is consistency, right? So we keep swapping governments. We've got an election next year. You know, there was an equivalent of Jobs and Schools Australia in the previous Labor government. The coalition comes in, they scrap that body. There is no equivalent body. JSA gets recreated, and next year there's an election. And if we change governments again, that might be the end of JSA. We don't know if there's going to be a bipartisan approach to, you know, the future of schools or early childhood education. We talk constantly about the number of education ministers we've had over that time, and you could probably count them on maybe 3 or 4 hands. And so can you just talk to me about consistency and how we... I know it's an intractable problem, but Barney, you're a political animal. Just talk to me about it.
Look, I think it's very important to have consistency. If we took the conversations going on in the higher education sector at the moment, in universities, I think universities are crying out for long-term policy certainty. They may not like all the policy settings that are currently being discussed, but they need stability, they need consistency, they need to know the trajectory and then to work within that frame. And I do think we need to be emphasising to government the importance of consistency. Now, I can't comment on the political frame. I'm certainly confident that Jobs and Skills Australia has a very bright future. I think it does great work. I hope all sides of politics appreciate that. But I will say, though, that we need it not to just to apply in higher education, we need it to apply broadly in the education system. We need to stabilise it. We need the investment. We need the evidence base to say we're getting on with the right interventions that are changing the dial. I mean, you and I talked a little earlier about some of the data coming out of the UK and the remarkable strength of the UK system over the last decade. And there's been a pretty disrupted political environment in the UK in the last decade or so, but yet their education system, for a variety of reasons, is actually improving. We need to learn from the international exemplars, and I think from that we'll get a great deal of opportunity. And there are all the right words are being spoken. We need to put them in action and make a difference. Okay.
So just talking about government policies that universities don't like, can we talk about migration? So obviously migration is critical to your work at Jobs and Skills Australia. At the same time, the government is putting the brakes on the national overseas migration, and that is basically all falling at the feet of international students and cutting the number of international students. The coalition is threatening to go even harder on that. How damaging, if I can use that word, is that for the potential of the future workforce in Australia, given how much we rely on bringing people overseas, educating them, and then having their skills flow through into the economy, either as permanent residents or as baristas or childcare workers or whatever else?
Look, I think this conversation going on, I'm not privy to what the government is going to announce in relation to international education and changes.
But you are doing modelling on skilled migration
Absolutely. We have a role to play at Jobs and Skills Australia to provide advice to government on skilled migration. We produce the skilled priority list, which is part of that consideration, but we also just recently we've submitted to government for their consideration what will become subject to government consideration, the core skilled occupation list, which is replacing the former skilled migration occupation list. So this is an important way...
Is it just a change in name?
No. Well, actually, no, it's not a change of name. In fact, it's quite a significant shift in the migration strategy, which is not only looking at what are the occupations in shortage. This is for temporary employer-sponsored migration.
Right.
There are no caps in the employer-sponsored migration. Not only does it look at the challenges around shortages, but it also takes into account, we're being asked to take into account, employment outcomes. So in other words, if people come into those occupations in shortage, are the employment outcomes positive or not? If they're not, we need to consider carefully what's happening in those employment areas rather than necessarily move to skill migration. So we are providing that advice. We have a role to play. We're very interested in how migration interacts with the skills shortage in Australia. That's a priority for JSA. To come back to the question, international education settings, I think the government needs to be very careful in those settings. I am, and I've said this as a Vice-Chancellor before I became Jobs and Skills Australia Commissioner, I see a need for a reset in the education profile. The Accord has made recommendations that government's considering around managed growth in higher education and what that might mean. In other words, planning and managing domestic higher education load. I think it's not unreasonable for us to plan and manage international load and international profile into the future. I think that makes sense. Australia's public universities are funded to deliver education for Australians, so the balance between international students and Australian students needs to be taken into account. The challenge here is to put these settings in place in a way that will ensure we continue to have a vibrant international education system in Australia. Vitally important to the country, vitally important to our universities. Getting those settings right will be an important challenge for government. We'll wait and see what they come up with.
We are waiting. Our first question is from journalists. Our first question is from Dan Holmes from the Mandarin.
Thanks very much for a great conversation. I was wondering if you'd be willing to turn that lens onto the public sector a little bit. We've talked extensively about education and industry, but of course government's one of the biggest employers in the country if we take state and federal as a whole. And of course the federal government in particular is suffering from some pretty acute skills shortages at the moment in a variety of areas. I'm wondering where that fits into JSA's priorities.
We have one of our Jobs and Skills Councils which focuses on public skills, and I know that they're looking at this particular challenge around, if you like, the public workforces around Australia, whether in the public services or more broadly in a range of organisations around the country, and it's a very important space. They're doing some workforce planning at the moment. I think they're going to be producing some interesting reports, as well as, I think, the opportunity for us to engage with the Australian Public Service and the big state and territory public services. If you think about what our priorities are for JSA over the next 12 months, to come to the nub of it, where does it fit in that priority setting? Apart from our ongoing body of work, which I've referred to in my speech in many ways, our two priority areas for this year coming: generative AI in the labour market and what influence it is having, will have, might have. Let's understand that better. Huge amount of interest in understanding Gen AI. It also cuts Gen AI. It cuts across the Jobs and Skills Councils. And we want to continue our work deeply on gender and some of the gender challenges in the labour market. So they're our priorities for big capacity studies over the next 12 months. We'll look at prioritising the Australian Public Service as an opportunity beyond that.
Great. I'm just wondering about other government employees as well, like nurses and teachers. This has been a particular problem in the regions and places like Western Sydney. Some of the researchers found that essentially it doesn't work to incentivise people to head out into these places and work there for a time. The only way to retain workers is to train them in place. I'm wondering if JSA has anything on that front.
Well, first of all, I think it's a great place to send people to do anything in Western Sydney, so let's get that straight. And there are fabulous nursing programs and allied health programs. I think at the Western Sydney University would be the suggestion I'd make, and they're in place as well. But we have, again, a JSC that's looking at the health space in some detail, and we want to work with the health department here about workforce planning. It's a huge issue, a huge amount of work's going on inside government about health workforce planning for the future, and we're very happy to support that as required. I think it's important as we contemplate the sort of changes that international education caps might bring, the change of the international education profile, that has implications for the health workforce of Australia. So there's a lot to take into account.
Okay, thank you. Chris Wallace. Chris Wallace is from the University of Canberra, author and esteemed former journalist.
Chris.
Congratulations, Barney, on the appointment. It augurs well for harmonisation within the sector. Go for it. 6 months ago, in your spot right now, Richard Dennis reminded everybody that the Australian government collects twice as much in student loan repayments each year as it does from oil and gas tax receipts. The higher education sector is reeling from decades of underfunding, having been made dependent on international student fee income. Now that rug's been pulled out. We now, this year, have the $50,000 arts degree. Jason Clare's correctly pointing to declining Year 12 participation as a very serious canary down the coal mine sign. You're a mathematician. How many more signs do we need that the fundamental model that has evolved over the last 40 years has become fatally dysfunctional? And when you intriguingly said in your speech that we should brace ourselves for alternative models, is there anything positive that you can offer today to give us hope in a sector that really is very despondent?
Chris, look, I was very fortunate to work with Mary O'Kane and the panel on the Accord, and that review is being considered by government. We have recommendations the government's accepted. We have an implementation committee for the Accord, which I am part of, and I know the work that group is doing at the moment around the future funding model for the sector, the future of needs-based funding for the sector, the future of our sector, sustainability and robustness of the higher education system in Australia. I have confidence in what's happening at the moment and the outcomes of that. It'll be up to the Minister and the Department to determine where the advice of the Implementation Committee and all of the feedback from UA and other groups that have come into the discussion at the moment, not just about the independence of the Tertiary Education Commission, let's take that one on notice, but let's look more at the fundamentals of moving to a managed growth system, the fundamentals of more investment in needs-based funding to uplift more Australians to participate in higher education. I think these are very positive things. We need to see the detail emerge before I think I'd put any sort of negative view on that. I think that's important. If we do have a Tertiary Education Commission, one element it has to address is the pricing and costing of higher education. So what universities are receiving and what it costs in recommendations to government over student contributions. That's a vital component of what an ATEC should be doing. I look forward to seeing the detail from the government about how it will go about that. We are at the moment transitioning, I mean universities, are transitioning from the JRG reforms, the Jobs Ready Graduate reforms, stabilised to some extent at the moment while new change comes in, but the new policy settings are what we're looking forward to, and I'm encouraged by what I'm hearing.
Being bold, do you personally endorse the sort of transformative infusion of new Commonwealth money into the system that is obviously required to get the sort of outcomes you're talking about?
I think the Accord made it very clear, if you want to bring about change, you have to invest in higher education. If you want to uplift equity students to participate more fully, we've got to invest. One of the biggest investments the government will need to consider, of course, over the next decade and beyond, is new places funded in the system, because we'll have growth. All the demographics say the same thing. We need growth. Part of being here today is to make it very clear that that growth in higher education is important and it's on scale. We need growth in vocational education and training through our TAFEs. We need more collaboration between the two sectors, because a lot of the jobs of the future are going to require that skill set from VET as much as higher ed, and in some cases the blending of the two. So, you know, we're going to need that big investment in more places in higher education and much more investment in VET.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Andrew McKellar, Chief Executive of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry.
Andrew.
Thank you, Professor Glover. Thank you for your address today. One question or two? Okay. First question, I go to the issue of apprenticeships, and of course you've got highlighted your personal experience in your family with the success of the apprenticeship system. Of course, you mentioned the review that's underway currently. I just wonder if you could unpack a little more around the importance of getting the balance right, financial incentives, other measures that will strengthen our apprenticeship system in the future if we're going to encourage more commencements and then ultimately more completions, and how we get the balance right between, getting people into the apprenticeship system, getting them through, getting a qualification and getting good quality jobs at the end of that process.
Well, of course, I'm not privy to what Ian Ross and Lisa Paul are working on at the moment in their suite of recommendations. I'm sure they'll be important. They will be important. I'm sure they'll be extensive, and I'm sure government will give them due regard. What I will say is a couple of things. I've had a chance to talk to apprentices over the last few months, and I've enjoyed those conversations with young people who've chosen this pathway. And when you sort of ask them, well, what are the challenges you're feeling? Why aren't some of your friends and schoolmates, why aren't they doing apprenticeships? And often the issue is more about the support they receive, the pastoral care, the mentorship, the workplace and work site support that they need to be successful. And in some cases, the attrition that we see, the high rates of attrition, relatively high rates of attrition in apprenticeships occurs in the first year. And it's often because we haven't done enough in schools to introduce young people to a smorgasbord of opportunity when it comes to the trades, which is why I'm attracted to what South Australia are doing with their technical colleges. Let young people experience different trade opportunities and then make a choice. They'll be far less likely, I think, to drop out in that regard. One of the things we did do from the JSA perspective is to do some work on alternative pathways to apprenticeships, where you have a Cert 3 and you have an apprenticeship pathway, a non-apprenticeship pathway. What are the outcomes like? Let's look at a comparison between. And overwhelmingly, the apprenticeship pathway is a better outcome. Those who complete the apprenticeship pathway stay longer in their occupation, in their trade. They tend to get paid better than those going through a non-apprenticeship pathway. So there's a lot to recommend the apprenticeship system. There are also some great examples, and I'm sure Lisa and Ian are looking at this, of where, whether it's through group training organisations or great employers, we're seeing good apprenticeship retention and success rates. A lot, I'm sure they're taking on board. I have a lot of confidence in their report.
Second question is to political animal Barney. You mentioned, you referenced the former Minister Brendan O'Connor, and I think it's true from a universal perspective. We did see him working very effectively across the sector, achieving some significant steps forward, new national skills agreement, the JSA, your own organisation, the Jobs and Skills Councils. In the recent reshuffle, of course, skills and training is no longer in the Cabinet. What is your strategy to ensure that skills and training, which of course are absolutely essential to the challenges that businesses face, it's very important from an employee perspective, it's a critical piece in the jigsaw puzzle around our future productivity strategy. How do we ensure, if that issue is no longer directly represented in Cabinet, when we have such a huge productivity challenge in front of us, how do we make sure that that remains at the top of the public policy agenda in this country, and what is your strategy to keep it there?
Look, I've had the pleasure of meeting the new minister on a number of occasions and speaking to him on a number of occasions since he took up the portfolio. He's got a lot of energy for this portfolio, and he and I have had some great conversations about where his priorities lie. I think he'll be a strong advocate for skills and training. I have no doubt about that. He has a great relationship with Minister Watt, and Minister Watt will also have carriage of skills and training through to Cabinet and in those discussions. So I'm confident that we have two ministers very supportive of skills and training, and they'll see a lot of me. And hopefully that will be helpful to make sure that they're appreciating the wonderful things we need to do around skills and training in this country. And the enthusiasm from both that I've heard give me a great deal of confidence.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Graham Catt from the Association of Independent Schools.
Yeah, thanks very much, Professor. A very passionate speech. Lovely to hear the passion, lovely to hear the speaking about innovation, speaking about harmonisation. That's all music to our ears. So we represent just over 1,200 schools, about 720,000 kids in those schools. And VET in schools is a really important part of that model. And it's exactly as you were saying, it's providing pathways, not just pathways to jobs, but importantly as well, as you touched on, pathways from poverty, pathways from trauma, giving aspirational people new ways of thinking. There's a lot of passion in those schools, there's a lot of innovation, and I think that question really is when we talk to those educators, when we talk to those principals, those specialist teachers that are actually running those programs, the real story that we hear back is often it's one of complexity, it's one of grappling with regulatory systems, it's one of grappling with different regulations across states and territories, different jurisdictions. And the other one that goes along with that, and particularly for our sector, is the sort of dichotomy, and it's different across states and territories, of views of the private sector versus the public. You spoke a lot about TAFE, but there are some great partnerships happening between independent schools or non-government schools, and also with the private sector providers as well. And I don't want to touch on that as a political question, but my real question is, if that's what our educators are telling us and that's what their experience is of the system at the moment and the very pathways we're trying to provide, I think we all agree we're in a crisis. I think we all agree we're poised on opportunity. We all agree on where we want to go. So my question to you is, how do you get all of us to be on the same page? How do you get all of those different elements to pull together so that when we're talking to our educators, it's not a tale of complexity and barrier and challenge. It's a tale of working together and actually working with them to achieve the goals that they're looking for.
Well, it's a big question. First of all, let's touch on the complexity bit. And I think that goes to the heart of what I was saying. If we are trying to get a more connected, a more joined up, a more cohesive tertiary system in this country, then we've got to address the complexity, because it is a barrier. It's daunting. I mean, you don't have to be a young person trying to navigate your way through to a vet qual or into a connection between vet and higher education. Anybody at any age is going to find it actually very difficult to navigate. So the challenges are real, and the challenges of that complexity are a deterrent to young people to engage in tertiary education. We've got to address that. That's part of what I think having a more joined up system is about. One thing that JSA is doing at the moment is, and I'll recognise Peter Dawkins in the room again, because Peter's doing some work on tertiary harmonisation for us. We want to bring out some discussion papers on this during the course of this year to start to tease out what are the barriers, what are the benefits, where are the challenges, where can we see great examples of where we've been able to break down those barriers. And you're absolutely right to raise, it's not just about TAFE and universities, it's about our private vet providers as well, of which there are many in this country, very high quality private vet providers doing extraordinary things, many in the context of regional Australia where we don't necessarily have TAFE available. So we have to recognise that component as well. It's broader than just TAFE and universities. But let's try and strip out the regulatory complexity. Let's have the conversations about it. I keep hearing from people a willingness to engage in this conversation. So that's a very promising sign. And hopefully the work we're going to do will stimulate some further discussion, and that will bring us back with some recommendations.
Hope it does. Thank you.
Our final question is from Fiona. Sorry, Fiona. Scott from the National Electrical Communications Association.
Good to see you, Fiona.
Nice to see you, Barney. How are you? Yes, I'm here today from the National Electrical Communications Association. I'm also on the board of the Powering Skills organisation, as you'd appreciate, which is one of the Job Skills Council. I really enjoyed in your speech today how much you talked about electrifying the nation and the massive nation-building projects that we have coming down the line for the electrical sector, from decarbonisation, the transmission lines that will need to be built into renewable zones. If we're going to plug in our transportation sector, what that means for EV charging points, data centres that need to be built, plus huge population means lots of houses. So we already have a shortfall of 32,000 electricians in this country, and it's not a trade that can be solved through immigration. We really have to grab these young people through our school system and then pathway into our trades. We just want to know what you see as the priorities to achieve these economic outcomes, and how you see from your position at Job Skills Australia to be able to meet those economic outcomes.
Thanks, Fiona. And there was a good Western Sydney plug earlier, and I know you'd have...
Oh, no, you were fantastic. And, look, and to your credit, I mean, what you've led the world, led the country, particularly in Western Sydney, around the airport and the Aerotropolis. I mean, you know this space better than anyone.
Thank you.
Led the world. I love it.
Yeah, well, you know, it's a bit of a love society.
Thank you, Fiona. Look, only 2% of electricians are female. So one of the challenges is one of those very male-dominated professions. So the 32,000 figure, which, by the way, I now say is 31,999 because my grandson is now an electrician. So, as Damien will know, I'm making headway on the recommendations. But only 2% are female. We need to do a lot more about opening up that profession, that trade, to both parts of our potential labour market. One of the bits of data I quote a lot in the speeches I give is that if you look at gender-balanced occupations, only 25% of them are in shortage. If you're not gender-balanced, you have massive shortages. So we do need to find a way. And I know Powering Skills is working on this. How do we approach the gender issue? How do we approach those from underrepresented backgrounds to become more engaged in the opportunities of the decarbonisation of the economy? I think it comes back to our school system. I think it comes back to the aspiration. It comes back to improving outcomes there, encouraging more people into post-secondary education. VET in schools is incredibly important. It's not uniformly good across Australia. We can do more with the quality of infrastructure and the quality of our programs in schools to actually engage young people in the opportunities of the electrotechnology or the electrical trades opportunities or the engineering opportunities in the country. We need to do that quickly, because that 32,000 will only get worse and not better unless we bring more electricians in. But there are 37 other occupations that are equally going to be in shortage that relate to clean energy. So it's a huge challenge. Education's the core of the response.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Okay. Before we thank Professor Glover, I'd like to hand him an honorary membership to the
thank you very much.
National Press Club
I have
of
to
Australia.
declare this to the Commonwealth.
Yes. So please join me in thanking Professor Glover.
Thanks.